Development will come to order. I am very glad to have Senator Lummis as my new partner and ranking member on this subcommittee, and I really look forward to working with you over the next 2 years. Both Senator Lummis and I are interested and concerned and ready to dig in on issues of the shortage of housing, especially in rural communities, and the unique challenges that we see on tribal lands. And we are both, as we've discovered, focused on getting things done, so I'm confident that we'll be successful in finding common ground, and I look forward to the work ahead of us. And I'm also very glad to welcome Senator Fetterman, Senator Kennedy, Senator Vance, and Senator Brett to the subcommittee this year. So without safe, decent, affordable housing, nothing in your life works, and it's nearly impossible to maintain a job or go to school or stay healthy. Almost 600,000 Americans experience homelessness on any typical night, and of this number, about 60% of those experiencing homelessness are sheltered, while the other 40% are unsheltered. Homelessness is a significant challenge in our country, and we have to acknowledge that it's not getting better, it's getting worse. While we made big strides in reducing homelessness in the first half of the last decade, we know that the number of people experiencing homelessness began to rise again around 2016. And the pandemic only exacerbated the challenges that individuals and families have faced. The backdrop to the issue of homelessness is that our nation is facing an affordable housing crisis. According to data published by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, not one state in the country has an adequate supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters. In fact, for the 10.8 million families with extremely low incomes in the United States, there is a shortage of more than 7 million affordable homes, which is very alarming. The challenge of funding and keeping a safe, affordable place to live is real in every part of the country, urban, suburban, and rural, and it affects everyone. However, homelessness disproportionately affects some folks more than others, including Black and Latino and Native communities. In my home state of Minnesota, while Native Americans make up only about 1% of the adult population, the 2018 statewide homeless study found that they make up 12% of adults experiencing homelessness. So in December, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness published All In, the federal strategic plan to reduce and end homelessness. The plan calls for a 25% reduction in homelessness by 2025 and lays out a data-backed plan to make that happen. This is an aggressive goal, but I'm glad that we're aiming high here. We've learned a lot in the last few years about how to effectively address homelessness. The American Rescue Plan provided 70,000 emergency housing vouchers to rapidly rehouse individuals at risk of homelessness, especially veterans and victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And just last month, Secretary Fudge announced $315 million in awards to address unsheltered homelessness and homelessness in rural communities, along with thousands of vouchers. This coordination of grants and vouchers is critical, and I look forward to hearing more about how it can work from our witnesses today. I'm also looking forward to hearing more about how we can cut red tape, improve staffing, and make it easier for service providers and housing providers to do their jobs instead of worrying about administrative paperwork. We heard a number of suggestions at the hearing Senator Rounds and I held in this subcommittee last year on this topic, and I hope that we can find bipartisan ways to make existing programs work more effectively. There are several examples of bipartisan efforts in this area. Senator Reid and Senator Collins have a bill to reauthorize the Interagency Council on Homelessness. Senator Coons and Senator Kramer have introduced a bill to expand the Housing Choice Voucher Program and eliminate duplicative inspection requirements, a bill that both Senator Lummis and I have co-sponsored in the past. And there are other bipartisan efforts to improve the low-income housing tax credit, to address veterans' homelessness, and more at other committees. You know, I often hear from people working on homelessness that we know what to do to solve this problem. We just need the will to fix it. We have data-driven strategies that have proven effective in addressing homelessness in recent years and are helping people who have fallen into homelessness. But we must also address the housing affordability challenges at all levels that are driving people into homelessness in the first place. Addressing homelessness and the challenges of housing affordability has long been an issue that both Republicans and Democrats have been concerned about. So I hope that in this hearing we can continue that bipartisan work and look for concrete steps that we can take together to address this deep challenge with a comprehensive approach, effective strategies, and the resources that we need. And with that, I recognize Senator Lummis.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a delight to join you on this committee in this endeavor, and I, too, look forward to tangible results from this bipartisan effort. Thank you. And I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Right now, many American families are struggling to find safe, affordable housing. For some of these families, housing insecurity is a growing concern. There are many challenges that can drive an individual or a family to homelessness and make it harder to regain housing. The availability of affordable housing is part of the problem, but mental health challenges, physical disabilities, and struggles with substance use can lead to homelessness and make it harder to escape when it occurs. These problems cut across demographics. As a result, communities in every state right now, including my home state of Wyoming, are challenged to help those who are homeless or who lack stable housing. Today's hearing on the Biden administration's strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness provides a good opportunity to talk about what's worked and where we can do better. Housing First, a centerpiece of the administration's plan, is a policy that places individuals into supportive housing without any conditions. Individuals are offered supportive services, but are not required to use them. The term housing first then raises an important question. If housing comes first, what comes second? Individuals are placed into housing and then may choose whether to undertake mental health treatment or substance abuse counseling they need to live healthy lives. But how many people caught in the cycle of addiction, or the grips of a severe mental health crisis can recognize the help they need at that moment? At some point when housing first fails, and it does fail for some people, there need to be other paths to help. Shuttling vulnerable people between programs without needed treatment is not the path to housing independence. It perpetuates the problem. I'm disheartened at the administration's continued focus on a version of housing first without the integrated wraparound services some individuals and families require to overcome homelessness. As a result, we've drifted too far to housing only. Funding does not allow local organizations the flexibility to act on what they've seen work in their local community. I'd also like to see HUD and USICH spend more time on the unique needs of rural communities and tribes. These are important issues in Wyoming. Homelessness and housing instability look different in rural areas and reservations. Shelters are rare, and so many people turn to family and friends to get through a period of homelessness. As a result, homelessness shows up as overcrowding rather than tents on the street. But given how HUD conducts its counts of the homeless, these individuals and families living with family and friends would not be counted. We cannot fix problems when we are unsure of how big they are or where they are. Homelessness is a challenging issue, one that requires our best ideas. I look forward to hearing more from the witnesses about specific ideas to reduce red tape and help programs better serve vulnerable Americans. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Lummis. And I'd like to welcome Senator Brett to the subcommittee. We're very glad to have you with us today and as a member of the subcommittee. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our witnesses now. Today, we are joined by Jeff Olivet, who is Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Jeff has served on and been working on issues related to homelessness for more than 25 years, including as a street outreach worker and case manager. And Richard Cho is Senior Advisor for Housing and Services at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He has spent more than 20 years working on housing issues and previously served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. This hearing is hybrid format, so senators may join in person or by video. For witnesses, you will each have 5 minutes for your opening statements. Each of you will have a clock in front of you or on your screen, although you're both here, so no screens. And your full written statement will be made a part of the record. Mr. Olivet, you are recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Smith, Ranking Member Lummis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, Senator Brett. Homelessness is a life and death public health crisis. Tens of thousands of people die every year due to the dangerous conditions of living without a home. According to the latest data, more than 582,000 people experienced homelessness in the U.S. on a single night in January 2022. But that's only a snapshot in time. We know that over the course of a year, at least twice that number, more than 1.2 million people experience homelessness in our nation. Two major drivers of this crisis are the lack of affordable housing and the failure of wages to keep pace with the high cost of housing. By some measures, as many as half of those living in shelters and on the street are working, and yet full-time minimum wage workers can't afford a modest apartment in any county in America. Decades of growing economic inequality have left more than half of Americans living paycheck to paycheck and one unexpected car repair or medical bill away from homelessness. In 1970, this nation had a surplus of 300,000 affordable homes, and today a shortage of millions of units means that for every 100 extremely low-income renters, only 37 available homes are affordable. Where do we expect the others to live? We also know that health and homelessness are inextricably linked. Illness, injury, and medical expenses put people at risk of homelessness, and homelessness is harmful to people's health. People who are homeless face higher rates of mental health and substance use disorders. And like many health conditions, homelessness is deadly, but it is preventable. Every day, roughly 2,500 people exit homelessness in this country, yet the same number fall into homelessness. To solve this challenge, we must combine effective housing and wraparound supports with upstream prevention efforts that keep people from losing their homes in the first place. While homelessness has increased in recent years, we are beginning to see progress. After steady declines in homelessness nationally from 2010 to 2016, homelessness began to rise again. During the pandemic, however, we were able to come together to stem the tide. Between 2020 and 2022, we actually flattened the curve. And while unsheltered homelessness remains of paramount concern to this administration, along with rural homelessness and tribal homelessness, we have seen homelessness drop significantly among veterans, families, and youth. And what those successes show is that we can make progress, even in the most difficult of circumstances. When the pandemic put millions of people out of work and at risk of losing their homes, you came together to pass the CARES Act, then the American Rescue Plan, amounting to the largest investments in ending homelessness at any point in our nation's history. Congress expanded unemployment assistance, launched bold initiatives like emergency rental assistance, and provided financial support that saved families from starving and losing their homes. Together, Congress and the President prevented what could have been a massive wave of new homelessness. These investments also ended homelessness for tens of thousands of Americans. In just the last year and a half, HUD and VA initiatives helped more than 140,000 people move out of shelters, off the streets, and into homes. Building on these successes, our new federal strategic plan, All In, aims to reduce homelessness 25% by 2025 and create a pathway to end it for good. With the help of Congress and state and local leaders, we believe that it is possible to achieve this ambitious goal. The plan is founded on an evidence-based, all-hands-on-deck approach, and it includes numerous strategies and actions to prevent homelessness, urgently address the basic need for shelter, and expand housing and support that help people exit homelessness. Work to implement the plan is already underway. Our team is developing implementation work plans and putting the strategies into action this year. As we move forward, we will work with Congress and our federal agency partners, as well as with people who have experienced homelessness, governors, mayors, providers, and others on the front line of this tragedy. During my 3 decades in this work, any progress we have made has come when we are united. We all have a role to play. Homelessness didn't happen overnight, and it won't be solved overnight. But with resources, creativity, and unity, I believe we can build a country where no one experiences the trauma and indignity of homelessness and where everyone has a safe place to call home. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Cho.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Smith, Ranking Member Lummis, Senator Brett, and other members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify and share some of what HUD is doing to address the nation's homelessness crisis. In every city, town, rural community, and tribal nation across this country, there are people, adults and seniors, people with disabilities, youth, families with children who lack access to safe and stable housing. No place is immune. But every day in each of those communities, there are also people, dedicated policymakers, political leaders, outreach workers, and housing and services providers who are equipping people to once again have a safe and stable home. At HUD and across the Biden-Harris administration, we're working hand in hand with those leaders to solve this crisis. And I'd like to take a moment publicly to thank those leaders for their commitment to addressing and ultimately ending homelessness. Regrettably, after 6 straight years of progress from 2016 to 2020, homelessness rose both in numbers and in visibility. Overall, homelessness rose by 6%. Unsheltered homelessness increased by 28%, and chronic homelessness increased by 43%. But our recent history tells us that this does not need to be the end of our story. Homelessness can be solved. I know this because it's happening every day across communities in this country. I know this because we've cut veteran homelessness by 55% since 2010. I know this because prior to 2016, our nation as a whole was reducing homelessness overall and for nearly all populations. Congress deserves the credit for the progress that we've made and that we're continuing to make. It was through the bipartisan 2009 Hearth Act that Congress started requiring communities and HUD for the first time to start tracking performance outcomes and to achieve those performance outcomes. Specifically, are more people exiting homelessness into permanent housing? Are lengths of homelessness episodes shortening? And are fewer people returning back to homelessness once housed? And by creating accountability for those performance measures, Congress, HUD, and USICH helped to transform our nation's homelessness response. Through year after year investments, Congress also enacted and scaled evidence-based programs to solve homelessness among veterans. I will say it again, homelessness can be solved. But to do it, we must continue to scale the housing and supportive services interventions that work, like permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and housing vouchers. We must continue to keep communities focused and accountable to measurable outcomes. And we must continue to mobilize partnerships at all levels and across all sectors. The record over the last decade illustrates that solving homelessness requires federal leadership, both from Congress and the executive branch, to support what works. It will take all of us, government at all levels, and the nonprofit and private sector to work with urgency, both to help those experiencing homelessness today, as well as to prevent others from ever becoming homeless. Under the leadership of the President, Vice President, and Secretary Fudge, HUD has been working to solve homelessness with the urgency it requires, and to again move the trajectory of homelessness back in the right direction, downward. We're doing that by scaling housing and supportive services to meet the need. The American Rescue Plan funded 70,000 emergency housing vouchers, the first ever vouchers dedicated to addressing homelessness beyond veterans. To date, homelessness has been resolved for 47,000 households through those vouchers. We're also addressing the national shortage of permanent supportive housing through $5 billion in American Rescue Plan funding for the Home Investment Partnerships Program, an additional $75 million that we received in fiscal year 2023. And working with the Department of Health and Human Services, we're working to help communities to leverage HHS programs, Medicaid, SAMHSA grants, and community health centers to help provide housing-related supportive services. We're also directing resources and attention to unmet areas of need, especially people in encampments and other unsheltered settings, as well as in rural and tribal areas. Last June, we issued the first ever dedicated package of grants and vouchers to address unsheltered homelessness and homelessness in rural communities. And we're continuing to expand tribal communities' access to the housing and homelessness resources that we administer. We've also been reinvigorating community efforts to work with urgency to help connect people experiencing homelessness to housing and services. Through our House America initiative, we partnered with leaders across 105 communities across 32 states, representing over 50% of the nation's homeless population. Those communities collectively rehoused 100,000 households experiencing homelessness and placed 40,000 new units of dedicated housing to address homelessness into development. We also revived a new federal commitment between HUD, VA, and USICH to end veteran homelessness. And in 2022, 40,000 veterans were moved from homelessness into permanent housing. As Mr. Olivet noted, our latest data shows that the administration's early efforts are working with the resources and support from Congress. Amid a global pandemic and growing challenges in the housing market, we averted a spike in homelessness. Homelessness has remained virtually flat in the last 2 years. Family homelessness decreased by 6%. Homelessness among unaccompanied youth decreased by 12% in the last 2 years. And as I mentioned earlier, veteran homelessness decreased by 11%, the largest drop in 5 years. Veteran homelessness is now down 55%. I thank the committee for its deep concern for this national crisis of homelessness. And I'll say it again, that this crisis is solvable. Senators, we have reduced homelessness nationally before. In fact, 2/3 of communities across this country have reduced homelessness in 2010, and more than half have been continuing to see declines in homelessness since 2016. We're continuing to reduce it nationally for veterans and families with children, and we can reduce it and ultimately end homelessness for all communities and for all populations. As the president reminds us, there's no problem in America that we can't solve if we work together. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions from members, and unless we have any of our colleagues on television or on the screen, I'll go first, and then we'll go back and forth between the majority and the minority. Let me just start with this as a question for both of you. The recently released federal plan sets the bold but achievable goal of reducing homelessness 25% by 2025 in just a couple of years. And it's been described as an aspirational goal, but an achievable goal. Let me ask both of you, what have we learned from our successes in reducing veterans' homelessness and youth homelessness and family homelessness? What have we learned from those successes that we can apply to achieving this goal? Mr. Olivet, you can go first.
I think we've learned quite a few things. One is that the things that we resource, we see progress in. The things that we don't pay attention to, we don't. So the bipartisan support of addressing veteran homelessness, for example, has really borne fruit over the last decade. That's through programs like the HUD VASH program and supportive services for homeless veterans. The same is true with youth around the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project and others that have shown remarkable success on those areas that we really target resources. The resources that we're targeting are a combination of housing and wraparound supports, and that really is the recipe for how to end this, as many of you have noted already. I think another thing that we've learned is that it takes everybody. The communities that we see really making progress are where we've got mayors aligned with county administrators, with the nonprofit sector and the faith community and the business community in lockstep with what we're trying to do with federal resources. And where we see that alignment, we see good things happen.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cho, Dr. Cho, would you like to add to that?
Yes, Chairwoman. I would agree with what Mr. Olivet already said. Working to reduce homelessness ultimately is about, can we move more people out of homelessness into stable housing quicker than more people fall into homelessness, and also can we prevent more people from becoming homeless? Mr. Olivet already talked about the unity that's needed. I think what holds communities up and what sometimes reduces their ability to work with speed to connect more households to stable housing is often the disagreements that happen at the local level about what needs to happen. And those distractions often delay a commitment to helping do everything that it takes to cut through red tape and assist more individuals and families and youth to obtain permanent housing. So it's speed, but it's also having the resources on hand. Our data shows that for veterans, communities have pretty much enough resources to house veterans who become homeless. For families, only 1 out of every 3 families with children who experiences homelessness has an available housing resource available at the community level. For individuals, it's even worse. They often have only 1 available housing intervention for every 7 individuals who's experiencing homelessness. So we need resources, evidence-based practices, scaled to meet the need. And we also need to help communities to work with urgency and efficiency, and that means also having the unity at the local level that prevents them from those distractions.
Thank you. I think that the data that you cited about how it's difficult to make progress if you have as many people entering into homelessness as you have leaving homelessness, and there's this sort of churn or just kind of constant processing that it is. That is just part of the big part of the problem, which gets to me to the point that the individuals that are experiencing homelessness are very diverse, and what's happening to them is extremely, you can't paint it all with one picture. This gets, I think, as Dr. Cho is raising, the question of prevention. What can we do to prevent people from getting into that cycle? Would either of you like to just address that briefly and specifically? What are one or two things that we need to do to make sure that we can stop people feeding into the problem of homelessness? Entering into, I should say.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right to point this out. We've gotten increasingly sophisticated as a nation at bailing the bathtub. We see successes all the time of people exiting homelessness, getting connected with mental health care and substance use treatment and jobs and community and family. What we've not done is turned off the faucets that are flowing into homelessness. And so when we start thinking about where people are coming from, where people are most at risk of becoming homeless, we think about young people aging out of foster care. We think about people serving in our military and transitioning to civilian life, or coming out of domestic violence situations. These very tough environments, but we're not doing a good job at partnering with those systems to make sure that we're sharing homelessness prevention as a common goal.
Yep. I just want to mention what I'm about out of time, but I hear over and over again that if you really want to get to the bottom of this challenge, you have to be working hand in glove with people who have experienced homelessness themselves, folks that have lived experience is sort of the term that is used, but I mean, it's people who understand what's going on. Could you just, maybe Dr. Cho, could you just respond to that quickly? How important is it to be really building strategies and coming up with solutions with folks that have actual experience?
I think it's vital and something that we've built into a number of programs. We learned it the most through the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, where it became a requirement that young people who have had a lived experience with homelessness are placed in positions of decision-making to help design the kind of programs and systems that are needed to address homelessness. And you learn things from talking to people with lived experience that a provider who's never experienced homelessness would never have thought of. For example, that some people don't feel safe in shelters. They feel that they are at risk of violence or having their possessions stolen. And if we don't understand what the experience of actually being in a shelter is like, we'll design environments that maybe people don't want to come into, and no wonder we see people outside.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Lummis.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you for being here today. And certainly when Congress just doesn't do a reauthorization when it comes up, we just do these continuing resolutions over and over, we forget to pay attention. We forget that when all else fails, read the directions is always good advice. We don't go back and read our own directions, see how a program was designed and how it's being applied now, and whether something was lost in translation. And I'm of the opinion that maybe some of those things are at play here. So I want to explore that a little bit in my questions to you. Mr. Olivet, among the tools for action on USICH's website, there's a Housing First checklist that's intended to help make a basic assessment of whether and to what degree a particular housing program is employing a Housing First approach. So if a tenant is unable to abide by the terms of a tenancy, every effort is made, according to the website, to move them to another housing situation program or project. Would you agree that these are principles of Housing First?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for raising the issue of Housing First. And sometimes what we see is a discrepancy between the directions, as you so rightly said, and how things play out in the real world. We know that Housing First does not mean housing only. And I was a case manager in this field before we had Housing First. And what we were doing was not working very well, making people jump through a lot of hoops before they got into housing. And so we would see people languishing in shelters and in vehicles and on the street with serious mental health issues, untreated substance use issues. And what I hear from people over and over is that it's incredibly hard to get sober and stay sober if I'm outside. It's very hard to address my mental health if I don't have a stable home to go to. So the whole principle of Housing First was get people into that stable foundation as quickly as possible and provide really good wraparound supports to help them succeed. And that works very well for many people, but not everyone, as you said.
And so my question is, and my concern is that maybe some of those wraparound services aren't actually happening. That instead of saying, okay, we're going to give them services, and when they're ready, we'll put them in a house. Now we're saying we'll provide housing, but then not requiring these wraparound services that give them the help, knowledge, and information and support they need to stay in that house.
I think what we've seen is that when those services are readily available to people, many, many people choose them. And as you said, it doesn't work for everyone. I think the success rates in Housing First are something like 90%. It's an extraordinary success rate. Good. But that also means that 1 out of 10 folks aren't being served well and may return to homelessness. We need to do a better job supporting them.
Should they be required to access those services as opposed to leaving it voluntary?
I think voluntary treatment is the thing that works best. I think when people are forced to do treatment of some kind, it's not always as successful, and people don't always do as well in that treatment.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Olivet. And Dr. Chow, thank you for your 20 years of service in housing programs. That's a commitment, and we appreciate your years of expertise. So in rural areas, as I mentioned, some people just cram themselves into housing. It happens a lot on Indian reservations. As opposed to being homeless, there are many families under one roof. So how do we account, and this has got to be hard, but how do we account for those people? They're underhoused.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. We recognize that in rural communities and in tribal communities in particular, homelessness looks different. And our definition of homelessness does include people who are living in substandard conditions, who are living in places not meant for human habitation. And I've been to tribal nations where I've seen some of the conditions that people are living in severely overcrowded. And so that is part of the definition. And we've been working to increase more resources going to rural communities as well as to tribal communities. And with additional flexibilities, resources that we provide to tribal communities allows them to adapt the programs to the needs of their tribal communities. And for the rural resources that we've been providing, we took advantage of the fix that actually Congress made so that you can use some of our homeless assistance grants to make home repairs and other home modifications that are often needed to just make housing livable in those rural communities.
And my time has expired again. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to you and the ranking member for hosting, I think, what's a very important hearing and topic. A key element of combating homelessness is supportive housing or housing paired with supportive services such as treatment for health conditions and substance use disorders. It seems to me that these services are critical as they can help ensure families are able to stay in their home and provide resources to deal with conditions that make it harder to do so. So, Mr. Olivet, can you talk to us about the role expanding permanent supportive housing plays in the administration's strategic plan to end homelessness?
Thank you, Senator. One of the pillars of our plan is called housing and services, and we deliberately paired those two things. We know that housing is essential to end homelessness, but housing alone isn't always sufficient. And depending on people's life experiences, the challenges they're facing, people need different degrees of support. I mean, all of us do. You think about all of the support that we get from family and friends, from professionals, from therapists, from all sorts of both social supports and professional supports. The same is true for anyone who's been homeless. And so I think the key is to really tailor and individualize those wraparound supports in a way that makes sense for that family, for that young person, for that veteran, for that person living in in a tribal or a rural area. I know it gets harder when you're in rural areas in Alabama or Ohio or Wyoming, where there just aren't that many services. And I think that gets to be the real challenge that we all need to wrestle with. How do we scale those up?
Well, I'm glad to hear that access to supportive housing is a core element of the plan. We look forward to working with you on those services. Let me turn to another issue. HUD's most recent annual homelessness assessment report, or AHAR, shows that the number of individuals experiencing chronic homelessness has continued to increase, even as the overall number of people experiencing homelessness has mostly leveled off. Dr. Cho, what factors are driving the increase in chronic homelessness specifically, and what additional steps can we take to moderate the trend of rising chronic homelessness?
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that, Senator. And I think you actually answered that in your first question, which is we've seen a significant decrease in the production of new permanent supportive housing, which is the best tool we have to address chronic homelessness. People experiencing chronic homelessness are people who've experienced homelessness long-term and who have a disabling condition, whether it's mental illness, addiction, or chronic medical conditions, often all co-occurring at the same time. And permanent supportive housing is the intervention that provides that wraparound supports along with affordable housing. From 2010 to 2016, our nation added 104,000 new units of permanent supportive housing to the national inventory. From 2016 to 2020, we only added 32,000 in that 4-year period. So the rate of new permanent supportive housing production was cut in less than half of what it was in the prior 6-year period. We need to get back to doing that. HUD is using resources from the American Rescue Plan as well as resources provided through appropriations to help communities provide the capital and operating as well as supportive services to create more permanent supportive housing. Through our Continuum of Care program, we actually fund about $240 million of those funds actually goes to pay for supportive services in permanent supportive housing settings.
I appreciate that answer. You know, AHAR 2022 detailed demographic data for the overall population of persons experiencing homelessness, but it does not have data for this population of persons experiencing chronic homelessness. Given the struggle these individuals face, whether it's that affordable housing shortage you just spoke about or whatever, I think it's critical that we understand more about them. Can you commit that you'll work on obtaining this data and making it public?
Yes, Senator, we actually do collect that in the second part of our AHAR reports, which tracks the number of people who use our homeless assistance programs. That is the latest data on that. Part 2 of our AHAR report covers 2019 and 2020, and in that report we do have demographics on people who are experiencing chronic homelessness,
okay, so
including their age.
And that's publicly that's made public.
Yes,
already.
it is, Senator.
All right, so I have to look at that. Finally, I worry that Congress met the challenge of the pandemic with a historic response, from the eviction moratorium to emergency housing rental assistance to housing counseling, the list goes on. That response was overwhelmingly successful in keeping people in their homes throughout the pandemic. However, these programs are expiring, and I worry that if we see a weakening of our core federal housing programs, what we're going to see is an increase in the homelessness situation that people will face. How can we ensure that the expiration of COVID-era housing programs don't contribute to rising homelessness?
Well, Senator, I think the answer is that we need continued investments through our regular appropriations for the permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and more housing vouchers. I know the President's budget will be released soon, and that will provide at least what the administration is seeking with regard to housing resources. We've learned a lot through the pandemic era programs, in particular the emergency housing voucher program, which is the first ever voucher program dedicated to homelessness specifically. And we've seen that be incredibly successful and popular. Housing authorities across the country have partnered with homeless continuums of care. That partnership has proven to be wildly successful in ensuring that these vouchers are reaching the households that need this the most. And we expect to see the impact of those resources when we release the results of the 2023 point-in-time count later this year.
We look forward to seeing the President's budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Senator Vance, welcome to the subcommittee, and it's now your time.
Great, thank you. Thanks to the chairwoman and the ranking member, and thanks to both of you for being here. Mr. Olivet, I wanted to just use my time to investigate and talk a little bit about the housing first approach to this particular problem. And I want to read something from the All-In Plan in the prefatory letter, and I just want to unpack this a little bit. So you write in that letter, the United States of America can end homelessness by fixing public services and systems, not by blaming the individuals and families who have been left behind by failed policies and economic exclusion. Now, I certainly agree that we all have to recognize that we're all a product of our circumstances in different ways, and you don't want to blame people for being down on their luck. But I also worry that the approach of seeing people, even people who are very, very significantly suffering, as pure victims sort of robs them of agency. And if you rob people of agency, the compassion that you have for them is not compassion for a human being, it's compassion for an animal. Instead of a human being who makes decisions, who's influenced by their environment, certainly. And I think that a lot of the housing first approach does precisely that. It sees people as pure victims instead of actors who, sometimes have very tragic things happen to them, but also can do things in the face of that tragedy to rise above it. I'm curious sort of how you think about this. I mean, you're dealing with people who have had very, very tough lives, often cases, childhood trauma, drug addiction, the whole gamut of it. How do you not slip into treating them as pure agency-less victims? How do you treat them as human beings? Because when I read this letter, I worry that you're not taking that approach.
Thank you, Senator, for asking a tough question. I start with a fundamental belief that we are all equal as human beings. We are all deeply flawed and beautiful and wonderful and powerful and broken all at the same time. That's true regardless of housing status. I've known many people who have experienced mental illness and addiction who never become homeless, and I've known a lot of people who are homeless who have never experienced mental illness or addiction.
Sure.
And it overlaps a lot. And you I think, rightly mentioned the prevalence of childhood trauma, physical and sexual abuse that scars people for decades to come, for their entire lives. But I also believe that recovery is possible, and I believe that very, very deeply. And what I've seen around Housing First, and I said this earlier, I was in this field in the mid-'90s when we weren't doing Housing First, and we set up a lot of requirements for people. What I saw in those approaches was dehumanizing and disempowering. What I see when we can get people the stable foundation of housing is that they can live into their best selves. And without that, it's nearly impossible to do. It's impossible for people to rebuild their lives without the safety of a door they can lock, without the safety of their own bathroom they can go in, their own kitchen that they can prepare their meals in. And so I actually see this as fundamentally humane and empowering, and very much treating the person as an agent of their own future.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that's very important. It's one of the things that I think often right and left talk past each other on these issues, because obviously, again, we are subjects of our circumstances. We're also individual human beings with free will. And I do worry that sometimes the anti-poverty lingo on the left very often glosses over that fact, even though certainly we have on my side our own problems. I want to just talk about the evidence basis of the Housing First policy. And I really recognize I'm short on time, but let me try to get this out quickly. So the first time I ever visited San Francisco, California, I thought it was one of the most beautiful cities that I had ever seen. And when you go to San Francisco now, when you go to the Tenderloin, or you go further south, you go to Los Angeles, you go to Skid Row, what you see is a community that feels like, and in fact, if you look at the violent crime rates, are approaching something like a third world country. I mean, just unbelievably catastrophic chronic homelessness, all the addiction, the abuse, the violence that comes along with that. And yet, California, since 2016, has supported the Housing First approach to ending homelessness, even as chronic homelessness has gotten way worse in the state of California. One worry that I have is that the evidence clearly shows over the past 6 or 7 years that approach hasn't worked. We should be looking for alternative approaches, and yet I worry that what we're talking about in this proposal is to take the California approach and take it nationwide.
I think there's a great evidence base that Housing First works for people. It works 85 to 90% of the time. And there are randomized controlled trials over 20 years that show that to be the case. In fact, there are very few other interventions in the homelessness arena that have the degree of evidence behind it.
But
now,
why has California gotten so much worse if this works so well?
we see people still falling into homelessness. I think if you look at the housing market, you talk about San Francisco, you talked about Skid Row in Los Angeles. I was in San Diego recently, and their vacancy rate is 1.4%. There are no units. And so even if you have a voucher, you can't go get one. We see elderly people falling into homelessness for the first time because they simply can't afford the rent. The rent goes up and their income stays fixed. And so to me, if we look at the intervention that's actually working to help people move out of homelessness and say, but we still have homelessness, so that must be a failure, it's a misinterpretation of what's actually going on. It is working at an individual level. It's not working at a population level for two reasons. We haven't scaled it up to meet the need, and we haven't turned off the faucet that's flowing into homelessness.
Out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Vance. And I want to just note that I appreciate, I'm not making a left or right comment, I am just noting that sometimes the language that we use to describe people who are experiencing homelessness can be dehumanizing. And we always talk about people as being victims or being vulnerable, that sometimes that seems to suggest that they don't, as you say, have agency and that they're not human beings with lots of assets. And so I wanted to just acknowledge that I heard what you were saying there. So, colleagues, I understand that Senator Sinema is on her way, and but while we are waiting for Senator Sinema, I defer to Senator Brett.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. To both of you, thank you for bringing this important issue before this subcommittee. I appreciate getting to be a part of the conversation and therefore hopefully getting to be a part of the solution. So thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Olivet, roll tide. Wanted to tell you both, appreciate your testimony, reading them and looking through it. Obviously, homelessness is something experienced by a wide variety of people in a range of circumstances across our great nation. Would you agree, obviously, individuals that experience homelessness, I think I've heard you say it, but just to make sure we're on the same page, it is adults, children's, veterans, families, people from all walks of life can find themselves in this position.
Absolutely. And I think not one story is the same.
Right.
You know, people have their own pathways into and out of homelessness. And if you just start breaking down the data, there are huge numbers of families who are experiencing homelessness. And even though we're making progress in that area, we can do more. The same is true for single adults. I talked about elderly Americans. Older Americans are one of the fastest growing groups of people experiencing homelessness. So we have to look subpopulation by subpopulation at what really works.
And so on that note, and Dr. Cho, I'd love for you to jump in here as well. You know, obviously these vast circumstances that are different in people's stories, how are we tailoring the services needed for each of these different families or people or individuals or children that come in front of you all?
Senator, that is actually a great question and something that HUD and actually Congress through the HEARTH Act began requiring communities to do. You know, prior to 2009, most communities' homeless services look like a loose collection of uncoordinated programs, each maintain their own waiting list. In 2010, communities just started developing coordinated systems so that we could actually do a better job of assessing their needs and matching them to the right level of assistance. Some people just need short-term rental assistance and housing navigation. Others need permanent supportive housing, intensive case management coupled with long-term indefinite rental assistance. Others just need a little bit of financial assistance and a point in the right direction. And I think what our ability to reduce homelessness is, can we use the resources that we have smartly to match people to the right level of assistance relative to their needs and strengths?
And so as we're doing that, you kind of talked about sometimes the hang up in local communities. I believe you kind of referenced that. What are we doing to partner with state and local communities? One, what are we doing to partner with nonprofits and charities and religious organizations that want to be a part of the solution?
Senator, our team has senior regional advisors around the country who work with governors and their teams, with mayors and their teams, as well as with the local nonprofit sector, faith community, business community, because we believe that you need all of those levels of government, private sector working together. So we're actively fostering those partnerships and trying to support best practices.
Is there any impediment in current practice that keeps those faith-based communities from getting to be a part of helping in this?
I don't see any impediment, Senator. I think we see lots of faith-based organizations who participate in efforts to end homelessness. I've learned a lot over the years working with faith-based organizations who provide supportive housing and other housing and services. I think another thing that Mr. Olivet and I have in common, in addition to working in homelessness for a long time, is that we're both, I believe we're both children of clergy.
Not a child of, but I've known a lot in my life.
Got it. Okay. So you know, our work in homelessness is rooted in the faith community, and they've always been a critical part of the homelessness services.
So from both of your perspective, we have a good working relationship across the board there.
It's community by community. I think in some areas there's very good alignment between how public funding is working and how faith-based service providers or faith community members themselves are working. And in other places, there's a lot of dissension and disagreement. And I think it's critical that those things are aligned. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
you just get a lot of finger pointing. And
Yeah, I appreciated your comments earlier about we need to align so that we can work together to make it happen. And I know I am almost out of time, so I will just jump ahead a little bit. But the National Alliance to End Homelessness calculated that in 2021, the U.S. federal government enacted over $51 billion in funding for selected homelessness and housing programs. And as we kind of look at that, I wanted to just talk specifically about something that my colleagues have already brought up, and that is mental health and substance abuse. 75% of chronically homeless suffer from mental illness, and 75% have substance abuse problems. And we know, obviously, that overlaps the majority of that chronic homelessness. So would you agree that in addition to putting a roof over their head, as we've discussed, that it is imperative that these people are given the resources and begin the process of being able to deal with the issues that have created the homelessness in the first place?
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator, 100% agree. And we recently have developed additional tools working with the Substance Use Mental Health Services Administration on how to tailor recovery supports while people are moving into stable housing from homelessness.
And one question, I have 19 seconds. So how long typically, thank you so much, Madam Chairman. How long do, on average, would someone who is homeless find themselves in this One Roof program or Housing First program being there?
I think it varies by person. Again, Housing First is not one single program model. It's different types of assistance. So again, some people only need 6 months, 3 months, sometimes 9 months of rental assistance. Other people who've been homeless for many, many years may need longer term housing supports, and Housing First can last indefinitely until they no longer need that level of rental.
So there are some people that are there indefinitely. Do those people ever have a moment where they shift into, well, now it's time for you to start utilizing the resources in front of you so that you can get back on your
Absolutely,
feet?
Senator. We see lots of people graduating from permanent supportive housing, either moving into housing without services or without, rental assistance without services, or even just moving into independent. There have been examples of people experiencing homelessness who've gone from homelessness to permanent supportive housing all the way to home ownership. It can really vary just as the pathways into homelessness.
Well, thank you so much. I believe we have to not only help people, but then give them the tools to help themselves. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brett. We now have joining us virtually Senator Sinema.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Housing is one of the biggest issues I hear about in Arizona. Whether you're trying to rent or trying to own, the cost of housing in Arizona is outpacing wages. Not just in Phoenix, but also in Tucson, Flagstaff, and throughout the Verde Valley. The cost of housing in Arizona has a direct nexus with the rise in homelessness in our state. That's why in February, I convened 2 events with leading housing stakeholders in Phoenix, one around homelessness and services and another around housing supply and affordability. First, we toured UMOM, the largest shelter services provider in Maricopa County, and saw how their innovative model provides childcare and workforce development alongside shelter services, ensuring that the tools to get back on your feet are accessible to the people that need them. Then we brought together industry stakeholders and affordability advocates to assess the market in Arizona, identify supply chain and regulatory challenges that are holding capital investment back, and craft solutions to these challenges. At each of these events, I was honored to be joined by Joan Service, a deeply respected Arizona leader on housing in Arizona, who was recently appointed by Governor Hobbs to lead the Arizona Department of Housing. What I learned at these events reaffirms my understanding of the problem. We have a supply shortage in Arizona, and in order to make housing more affordable and accessible for Arizonans, we need to build more of it. Specifically, we need to build the types of homes and apartments that everyday Arizona families can afford. And that's why I've co-sponsored legislation to expand the low-income housing tax credit, and why I support additional investment in the Housing Trust Fund and the Home Investment Partnerships Program. According to the Arizona Department of Housing, the state needs about 250,000 more affordable units to meet demand. To improve housing affordability in a genuinely sustainable manner, we need solutions outside of merely increasing demand-side subsidies without increasing the overall supply of available housing. In October of 2022, members of my staff toured Prescott's Fort Whipple alongside veterans groups, affordable housing developers, VA officials, and saw the need for affordable permanent housing in Arizona for veterans experiencing homelessness. Following that tour and discussion with local leaders, I raised the issue directly with HUD, and in HUD encouraged the department to award the 84 HUD vouchers needed to move forward with Fort Whipple's Veterans Housing Project. I've heard from Arizonans with rental assistance vouchers that they've been unable to use them, partially because of the lack of available rental units. However, project-based vouchers are a tool on the other side of the ledger that can help spur the development of affordable housing units like Fort Whipple. Can both of you speak to ways that Congress can strengthen project-based subsidy programs in order to increase the creation of affordable housing units? And specifically, what are some recommendations outside of just increasing funding or the overall number of project-based vouchers?
Senator, this is Richard Cho. I can respond to that question. Thank you for raising that. I agree 100% that project-based vouchers is an incredible tool to be able to add not only housing access but also housing units. We've talked about how it is difficult to be able to find housing even when people do have vouchers. That said, communities are finding housing, but it is a lot of work to try to find landlords and vacant units. Project-based vouchers is an incredible tool. One of the things that could be done is to review the statutory cap that exists on our voucher programs, where public housing agencies that administer those vouchers can only project-base up to 30% of their housing vouchers. Many communities have already reached their cap on project-basing vouchers, and some of those communities are the very ones that are seeing the lowest vacancy rates, and so actually need more project-based voucher assistance. So a simple thing that can be done, again, without new resources, is just providing waivers and flexibility to allow communities to go above that 30% project-based cap.
And Senator, this is Jeff Olivet. I'll just add to this. I was in Arizona recently, and I would agree with you that your state is lucky to have Joan Service running the housing department. I met recently with Governor Hobbs and much of her new cabinet, as well as with the mayors of Phoenix and Tucson and Nogales as we toured around rural areas as well as the cities. And I know the affordable housing crisis that you're facing in your state. And we've seen homelessness in Phoenix increase in, I guess, Maricopa County by almost 30% in the last couple of years. So the situation is certainly dire. I was also very heartened to hear Mayor Romero in Phoenix talk about using containers to create housing. That's an approach that we've seen used to great success in Los Angeles and other places. So I think these kind of creative models. It's also important to note that the balance of state in Arizona is one of the recipients of HUD's recent rural and unsheltered notice of funding. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that funding plays out in rural areas as well.
Thank you. Chair, I have additional questions, but I see my time's expired, so I'll submit them.
Thank you very much, Senator Sinema. Thank you for joining us. Colleagues, it's possible that I might have another colleague or two come, though I'm not sure. I'm going to ask another couple of questions, but Senator Lummis, I'd like to defer to you and have you go next if you have another question or two next.
Madam Chairman, this is your committee. You go right ahead.
Well, I like to go back and forth.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll ask my questions and then see if either Senator Lummis or Senator Brett would like to ask any others. So last year, when we heard from stakeholders who are working in the field on on what we could do, we heard a variety of ideas for how we can cut red tape and improve the functioning of our policy response. And these ideas included, for example, switching to a 2-year application cycle from a 1-year application cycle. You can see, Senator Brett, you're talking about local on-the-ground nonprofits or faith-based organizations that are trying to run a program, and every year they're having to reapply. That was one idea that we heard. We also just heard about the importance of having resources for staffing so that frontline workers that are often barely staying out of a condition of homelessness themselves because they're paid so little. Increasing resources for staff would make a really huge difference, especially for those frontline staff. incorporating some of the flexibilities that we did use during the pandemic, incorporating those flexibilities into programming going forward. I'm wondering if either of you would like to comment on those ideas for how we can make these programs work better.
Yes, Chairwoman, I can answer both of those questions. I think the idea of making the continuum of care and a 2-year renewal cycle would be, pivotal to helping free up the capacity at the local level to focus on what works, which is to actually figure out how to help more people exit homelessness. The continuum of care right now is an annual cycle. The process of applying for annual grants is, let me just put it in context, there's 386 continuums of care. They all collectively administer about 7,000 separate grant agreements, and they have to apply for those 7,000 grant programs every year on an annual cycle. And so that is just a huge administrative burden that communities face. And so the very people who are trying to do the work of actually addressing homelessness are often tied up in an application process that takes many, many months. So shifting to a 2-year cycle would be game-changing for those communities. Second, I'm sorry, I forgot your other question, Senator.
It had to do with boosting pay for frontline staff that are so struggling to make ends meet themselves.
That's right. Thank you so much. That's critical, and we've encouraged communities to increase pay of frontline workers through our homeless continuum of care funding. The challenge is because it is funded at a fixed level on an annual basis. Communities have to make the choice about whether they're going to actually reduce the amount of rental assistance they're providing. Are they going to serve fewer people in order to raise wages of the frontline workers? And so it is a difficult kind of trade-off. And I think the only way that can be really done is to increase funding for the continuum of care program so that we can both add more housing capacity to serve people while also increasing the pay of the frontline workers who are trying to help those vulnerable individuals and families obtain housing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Senator, I would just add to that. On the workforce front, it's a crisis. Even before the pandemic, we saw 50% turnover rates in the homeless services workforce. And this is a workforce that is doing very hard work for very low pay. Something like 25% of those working in the programs, outreach workers, case managers, have been homeless themselves. So we have a lot of lived experience in that workforce, which is a rich and wonderful thing. But we're not supporting them very well. And that's despite wonderful nonprofits out there trying to do this work. The other thing that we're seeing is philanthropy sometimes stepping in to help close that gap, which is a wonderful thing. But when philanthropic dollars are going to sort of support the workforce, then it's money that is not being used for housing, for treatment, for other things. It's a really delicate balance. The challenge has only gotten worse during the pandemic because we asked people to do a lot. These were emergency workers. They were showing up every day for the last 3 years when everybody else was at home on Zoom, when many of us were in the comfort of our own homes. These folks were out there doing the work. And we lost a lot of people during the great resignation and people just burning out. And I think whatever we can do together to support and incentivize that workforce to stay engaged is going to pay off.
Thank you very much. Let me just get one more question in, one more point in. We're seeing innovative solutions for addressing homelessness and emergency shelter. I really am quite intrigued by what a project that we have in Minneapolis called a Vivo Village, which is basically providing tiny homes completely indoors, also with services for folks. So it was, created, as we've been talking about, with people who have experienced homelessness, who have talked about how difficult it is to move indoors when you don't have privacy, when you can't have your pet with you, and it's really, really working. The Vivo Village model. People have privacy, they have autonomy, and they're able then to be able to focus on getting the services they need to be able to move forward. I'm just wondering if I'm sure you see examples of this kind of innovation in our work around addressing homelessness in other parts of the country. Maybe Mr. Olivet, you'd like to comment on this.
Senator, your state is doing some of the most remarkable things. I think Minnesota is leading the way in so many ways on innovative program models and reducing racial disparities in homelessness and really integrating tribal leaders into responding to homelessness and so many things. I've heard wonderful things about a Vivo Village. I've not been able to come to the Twin Cities since that got up and running. But what we're seeing around the country is a lot of innovation. Mm-hmm. People know that this is a crisis. They know that we need to address the crisis of encampments and unsheltered homelessness and rural homelessness. And what we're trying to do is spur that innovation. We need all good ideas right now because the crisis is still with us. And I think we need a range of bridge housing options. I wish we had enough housing supply to solve the problem right now and enough wraparound supports. But the reality is, as we're building that, we also need really creative ideas to get people safe right now.
Thank you very much. Senator Lummis?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It was alluded to earlier that during the pandemic, the American Rescue Plan Act, the COVID Relief Bill, and the CARES Act combined nearly $85 billion towards emergency housing and homelessness assistance. But during those years, the levels of homelessness essentially remained unchanged, partly due to this, some people exiting homelessness and others entering. Yet at some point, that money's going to expire because it was one-time money. What are some concrete ideas for improving the programs we already have without spending more money? It's just unsustainable to fund at the levels we did during COVID. And not just fund housing, but fund a lot of things.
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator. I think much of that, and I've never seen that tallying up of all the funding in that way, but and a lot of that was actually for emergency rental assistance that was intended to prevent evictions and people from losing their homes. I would agree that we need to think through some creative solutions to figure out how to do that. That was, in some ways, the first significant federal program intended to prevent evictions and housing loss for people. And that did have, I believe, an effect on reducing inflow into homelessness in the last 2 years. But there are questions about how we are going to sustain that. And so that's an important thing. We are also just looking at how to take some of the innovations, regulatory flexibilities that we've had through CARES Act and American Rescue Plan and figure out how to make those part. And so that's one thing that can be done without necessarily new resources, is just look at the regulatory flexibilities and what worked for our voucher programs, for our homeless assistance programs that cut through red tape and help people move into housing more quickly.
I think you've really identified something important with flexibility, because every state's needs are different. In Arizona, they don't need nearly the insulation that we need in our northern states. And, insulation and snow load, we actually have to build our roofs at a much stouter load-bearing level because of the snow load. It's just so heavy. And yet there are issues in states that, are subject to tornadoes that are very different than what I have to deal with in my state. That might be something that Senator Brett has to deal with. How can we make sure that these programs incorporate those kinds of local unique challenges?
Well, Senator, many of those regulatory issues may be at the state and local level. And so I think what HUD has been doing and this administration's been doing is encouraging communities to address some of those regulatory issues that prevent the creation of more housing. And so that's something we've been looking at. But also, just within the federal programs that we administer, we had additional waiver authorities that were provided through Congress for those special programs through the American Rescue Plan and CARES Act programs. CARES Act waivers have largely expired or will expire soon. I think it may be a good conversation to think about how to provide HUD with the regulatory flexibilities through the regular programs that we administer, the things that we've learned, how to cut through red tape so that communities don't have to let documentation be a barrier to obtaining housing assistance, or people can house people and then obtain documents to have additional time. Some communities were able to actually increase their payment standards for vouchers because we gave them flexibility. We were able to do that through emergency housing vouchers through the American Rescue Plan, but housing authorities don't always have that flexibility with their regular voucher programs.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a really important conversation. With interest rates as high as they are, it's not only dried up the creation of new housing stock, but it has dried up the creation of new build-ready lots because the cost of even PVC pipe, sewer pipe, infrastructure has gone so high that you can't put a build-ready lot on the market that a buyer can afford to build a product on that is affordable to home buyers. And I think it hurts attainable housing and affordable housing more than any other market. So I hope that some of the monies that were available under the American Rescue Plan and CARES is still available during this time of high interest, because it's only going to get worse for a while until we can get over this inflation and approaching recession. We just heard from Fed Chairman Powell yesterday that they expect higher interest rates and perhaps in increments coming sooner. It's not good news. And so this dialogue is really important, and it needs to continue. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Senator Lummis. And I want to just mention that following up on the hearing that we had last summer, we have done some preliminary work on legislation to address some of these issues around, like, streamlining and overcoming some of the red tape burdens. And so I would welcome the opportunity to work with any of my colleagues on that legislation going forward. Senator Brett, do you have any additional questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I just wanted to ask a couple of process questions, specifically first about definitions. I am an attorney by trade, so I have learned that definitions matter. And just want to know, from your perspective, the definition of homelessness for HUD programs includes people living on the street or other places not meant for human habitation, in emergency shelters or in transitional housing. Additionally, that differs from some other federal programs, such as the Department of Education's Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, which considers a student that's experiencing homelessness if they're, quote, doubled up on family or friends' couches or staying there for economic reasons. I've also heard, when we're talking about rural communities, we're talking about the underhoused, and so we've used several different definitions. My question to you is, in your experience, have these different definitions created an impediment to success, or would conforming them or creating a more comprehensive definition help you be able to better coordinate across multiple agencies and resoures? Yeah, both of you.
I'll take that first, just because it is HUD's definition that you referred to, Senator. Thank you for that question. We have different definitions of homelessness between HUD and Department of Education, because they largely serve different purposes. Our definition informs who we count on the point-in-time counts, but it also informs who's eligible for the roughly $3 billion in homeless assistance grants. That is out of a much larger HUD budget and set of programs that we administer. Education's definition largely governs the rights of children and students and their access to educational supports if they're experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And so schools have an obligation to provide continuing education for students regardless of their housing instability. I don't think that necessarily changing the definitions will solve the problem, because essentially many of the doubled up families and families who are experiencing homelessness already are eligible for many of HUD's other larger homeless assistance programs, our affordable housing, our multifamily programs, housing vouchers, and public housing. The challenge is that there's not enough vouchers in public housing and affordable housing to meet their need. Simply just redefining them to make them eligible for HUD's much smaller set of programs isn't going to necessarily meet their needs, particularly because that program is not necessarily growing. I think the answer is ensuring that homeless families who are doubled up or experiencing housing instability have access to affordable housing, and that is going to take investments across all of HUD's programs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chow. And from your perspective, obviously being the executive director for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, you probably have a different perspective with regards to dealing with different resources and agencies and others. What are your thoughts on that?
Our council is comprised of 19 federal agencies,
Woo!
and it's our job to help point them in the same direction
Okay.
around homelessness strategy. And so this is a question we deal with all the time. And at the community level, I've worked in programs that have been funded by Health and Human Services, the VA, HUD, Department of Ed, and probably many others. And what we see is at the community level, agencies are pretty sophisticated at blending and braiding funding streams to serve the populations that they're serving. The reality is that human beings are bigger than these definitions, and they are more than their housing status. And so if we're looking in rural Alabama or Wyoming versus Trenton, New Jersey, or San Francisco, California, it looks very different, but it also looks different from month to month or year to year for people. There might be somebody who's doubled up now who's in a shelter 6 months from now, or somebody who's living in their car now who then is staying with friends and family next week. So I think of these definitions as really program eligibility lines. And so it helps Department of Ed cast a broader net for reaching all of the children they're trying to serve in the education setting, or for community health centers that are serving people through Healthcare for the Homeless grants to be able to reach as many people as possible, including a broader swath of folks who might be doubled up. As Dr. Cho said, the HUD programmatic lines are very targeted. And so the tighter kind of conception of who's eligible for those programs, I think, I'm not going to speak for HUD, but allows a more narrow targeting of where those dollars go.
Thank you so much. And lastly, just want to thank you. When we look at what is happening with our veteran population, and you both referenced getting more and more veterans out of homelessness and back having, the pride and dignity of moving forward on their own. I believe that our veterans are the best among us and put it all on the line and gave us their very best. It is certainly our turn to give them ours. And as you have dealt particularly with that population and with those different challenges, what have you seen to be the most effective within that community in helping them come back out of homelessness?
I think our work collectively between Congress, the executive branch, and communities across the country, especially VA, to solve veteran homelessness is a case study in what effective government and partnerships with communities looks like. A commitment to evidence-based practices, a commitment to working with urgency, and I think the importance of federal leadership as well. When we've seen VA secretaries make a public commitment to ending veteran homelessness, that matters, and that pushes that urgency down at the local VA medical center level and with their community partners. We've seen Secretary McDonough and Secretary Fudge make that public commitment when they first came into their offices to end veteran homelessness, and that sent a message widely across the nation to once again use the federal resources that Congress provided to make sure that no veteran is left on the streets and to prevent veteran homelessness. And we are seeing, again, that curve on veteran homelessness start to decline once again.
Thank you.
And if I could just briefly add to that, I think the work on veteran homelessness is one of the bright spots. It is bipartisan in nature. It's sustained over multiple presidential administrations, over a decade. We've seen a 55% reduction in homelessness in this population and 11% in the last 2 years. It takes the best of what HUD does and lets them do it. It takes the best of what the VA does and lets them do it. As you all probably know, Secretary McDonough is chairing our council right now. Secretary Fudge was our chair last year, and Secretary Becerra at HHS is our vice chair. That continuity across HUD, VA, HHS, and all of our other agencies is what's working. And I think we could take the veteran successes as a case study of how to do this with other populations.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Unless we have any other questions from the subcommittee, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for providing your testimony. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, which will be Wednesday, March 15th. For our witnesses, you will have 45 days to respond to any questions for the record. Thank you again for being with us, and thanks to my colleagues. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.